from Cryptsoft and on OpenSSL after Heartbleed. If you can give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I can't see a thing from up here, which is useful at times. Hopefully everybody had a good night last night and didn't struggle too much getting out of bed this morning. I know it's been a fun conference so far. So one of the things I'm actually here to talk about, of course, is OpenSSL and Heartbleed. So I'm just going to launch straight into the presentation. So how many people know the significance of this date in the audience? Wow. Well, that's when Heartbleed was announced. And for the first time, we turned around and found ourselves facing a defect in a system where there was a nice, cute logo, there was a website, there were PR agents, there was more written about the exploit and information around the exploit itself and how it was going to impact everybody and its impact on mainstream people than pretty much any other defect that we'd seen before. So a lot of work went into the PR around this. And everybody turned around and saw it as oh damn, Heartbleed, time to rekey the entire internet. The world has fallen. Everything's broken. I need to get out there and do something now. I need to panic. I've got to change all my passwords. So what was Heartbleed? And it was actually one of the few defects for which you'll find a nice XKCD 6-panel cartoon session describing a buffer overflow in 6 cartoon panels, which we thought was pretty amazing, pretty interesting to see. And from that perspective, it's something that somebody who's not a developer can kind of get the concept, like you gave me back more than I was expecting. And not often do you get to discuss buffer overflows with your parents and your grandparents. So to give you an idea of how much mainstream press paid attention to Heartbleed. So if we have a look at it, this sort of front page coverage of effectively mainstream news outlets that don't normally cover any of the technical press at all. We're talking about Heartbleed. The sky has fallen, everything's broken, it's no longer safe to go online. And this sort of information had a tendency to attract a phenomenal amount of attention worldwide on, in essence, a fairly nasty bug in a major piece of software. So when we turned around and had a look at it, as a project team, we were busy scrambling to turn around and deal with the issue, remediate it, deal with everybody who's involved in the process. But at the same time, a second wave of media came about the first wave of media. And that started getting very interesting for us. So there's just a little quote up here. It has changed how security researchers approach describing what it is that they've done. You need a PR team, you need a catchy name for your bug, and you need a logo. And one of the fun things that we found after Heartbleed is sometimes you get competing logos. So I counted 8 different logos for Shell Shock, and nobody seemed to settle on which one it would be. But it's an aspect of security vulnerability research that had just not come to the fore previously. So now a security researcher has the opportunity, if they have a PR team, if they have a nice logo, if they have a catchy name, they might get mainstream coverage. Mainstream coverage equals more interest, equals more business value. So there's a lot more motivation for a security researcher to actually put in the work not just on the exploit and not just on the technical details, but to have a PR story to go with it as well. And that has absolutely changed how most defects have been reported in the last 2 years. So Heartbleed, it was like the end of the world. Like all online banking broke, everybody had to change their passwords, every machine had to get redone, life and death. The whole universe was collapsing, the sky is falling. Well, in reality, there's a whole pile of other defects that have been occurring both before and after that are of a serious nature, that have impacts that can turn around and certainly hit your security. Heartbleed's not alone, but certainly Heartbleed had some unique aspects that made it much more concerning. So if you're familiar with all of the CVEs, this is just a selection of the ones that were fairly major around the same time. And if you turn around and have a look at it and you assess the overall impact, the exploitability, and the rating that's given to a CVE, you turn around and have a look up here. Heartbleed, very, very exploitable, but overall its rating in the grand scheme of things wasn't that high. There are other defects that had a much higher rating that got a lot less coverage, a lot less publicity. And as far as we could tell, Heartbleed has probably had the most publicity of a defect in a piece of software in about the last 2.5 years of anything that we've seen. So what actually happened? How did Heartbleed come about? And it's one of the things that you would imagine as a project team, we were pretty interested in understanding how did this happen so we can try and reduce the likelihood of it happening again. Well, simple buffer overflow. One of the things that you go to university, you study, or if you work in an organisation that's focused on security, thou shalt not have buffer overflows. They're very easy to write, they're very easy to fix, they're very easy to miss. So in essence, a piece of code got contributed to OpenSSL, got added into the tree. Yes, it did get added into the tree kind of close to midnight on the last day of the year. So not exactly mainstream time for reviewing, but in essence, nobody saw the issue. The defect was there, and it survived. Now, we like to say almost 3 years. In reality, it's 2.4 years. In mainstream media rounding, that's 3 years. And in essence, everybody in the project team missed the bug. The person who checked the code in missed it. Everybody on the team missed it. Everybody out there who looks at OpenSSL and is looking for defects also missed it. All of the major teams that turn around and work in the organisations that depend on OpenSSL to provide their security also missed it. And one thing that the mainstream press and certainly the code analysis tools that are out there have missed is no static code analysis tool found Heartbleed. None. Zero. Now, 2 days later, they all found it because there's an update and there's a whole range of additional tests that go in. But at the point in time at which Heartbleed was discovered, it was discovered by people effectively doing fuzz testing and going, hey, something strange here, and then looking at the code. It didn't leap out as, that's an obvious bug. Now, once you knew a description of what the problem was, it takes about 5 minutes to sit down, walk through the code and go, hey, there's something wrong here. There's a missing bounds check. And the fix for it is trivial. But in terms of determining in a 500,000 line code base, where are you going to find exactly where that issue is, that's a hard piece of work. The other unique aspect of Heartbleed, and this didn't get much mainstream coverage, a client could attack a server, but much more interesting from an attacker perspective, servers could attack clients. So you could be sitting there in your perimeter defense-centric corporate environment, browsing securely, utilising applications that are working with OpenSSL, and the server could be launching attacks back through all of the outbound protections that you've got going. So it impacted not just the servers, but also the clients. So in essence, anybody using OpenSSL for TLS in either a client or server context, which was pretty much everybody using OpenSSL, needed to do an update. And that was not a good position to find yourself in as a project team member, not a good position to find yourself in as a user of OpenSSL from a developer perspective, and certainly not a good position to be in from an end user perspective. So the actual code going in was pretty small. So about 600 lines of code into a 500,000 line code base. So for those of you who like to do calculations, less than 0.1% of an addition to the code base introduced this issue. It went in with no fanfare, just straight into the code. So what was going on before Heartbleed came along from an OpenSSL perspective? The project was effectively limping along. Not a lot was happening in the project itself. There was no formal announcement process, no idea of at what point in time will the next release of OpenSSL come out. What are you working on? What's going to be fixed? When can I expect my defect to be looked at? The answer to all of those were silence. So you never knew what was going to happen in the project. The source remained, how should we put it, arcane and unapproachable. So it did mean for the developers it was pretty hard to maintain, but more importantly for the pool of people who wanted to contribute to OpenSSL, it was difficult to contribute. So it was pretty common to turn around and see patches come in and get ignored for years. The developers, of course, who were working on OpenSSL had day jobs or were trying to earn a living or frankly had no living at all. So everybody was overworked, overcommitted, underpaid. And when that combination occurs, you have a tendency to not be particularly open to taking input that's coming in. The project donations in the 2 years leading up to Heartbleed were about less than $2,000 US. Now, I don't know your viewpoint on it, but I know I don't do much work for less than $2,000 over a 2-year period. You know, you have a tendency to want to actually get remunerated for the efforts. You've got to be able to live. So from that perspective, there wasn't a lot happening in the project prior to Heartbleed. And if you turn around and have a look at the repository out at GitHub, this is over a 2-year period, every developer that did more than 100 commits to the tree. Both of them are listed here. More than 100 commits over 2 years. Not a lot. So in essence, we've basically got a couple of people contributing, and then the next nearest person was doing so little, it's not worth referencing. And that's not the sign of a healthy project. Certainly in commercial development, if you only have 2 people working on something, it's not a critical mass level to be able to keep maintaining a product or a project. So from that perspective, the signs were there that things weren't particularly healthy within the project itself. So, how could we, as a project team, let that happen? Well, when you're tired, when you're busy, when you're not getting paid for it, when there's not a lot of people working on it, you don't really spend a lot of time trying to build community. You're not in the giving, outward-focused, trying to turn around and build a sense of community with your users because, frankly, your users are more of a source of problems and irritations than they are a source of contributions. So over time, that attitude has a tendency to build on top of itself. So with not a lot of welcoming coming in, with not a lot of renewing of membership within the team, with not a lot of contributions, no planning, as a project team, we had a reputation of not being inclusive, not being interested in working with our user base. And because all of the work that was going on that was funding those 2 developers was focused on FIPS 140, the people who were paying for that work to be done were enabling developers to live, so they got the focus. So not a lot was happening outside of that space. And it did mean that, well, because there's no resources, you can't take any risks. You can't go out there and say, hey, I'd like to try this out. Yeah, it might break on a few platforms, but that's okay. I've got plenty of time to help fix those if it breaks. Well, that just didn't happen. So, post-Heartbleed, the set of questions that came in were somewhat interesting. These are the toned-down, polite versions of the feedback the team received. It's sort of, you could sum it up as basically, how could you guys who we don't pay anything for ever make a mistake like this? You must be morons. We're never going to use your stuff again. Right? And that was very character building for the team, absolutely. So from that perspective, the feedback was pretty intense, not particularly appreciated, but the sentiment behind it is this is a project that everybody depends on. This is a project that should be well funded, that should have a team of people focusing on it because everybody's relying on it. It's been out there for a long time. It's one of the most widely used crypto toolkits on the planet. Why isn't it better funded? Why aren't there more people working on it? You know, how can developers make mistakes? And it's one of the things that led to a lot of, I guess, soul searching within the team. And after Heartbleed, a whole pile of things changed for OpenSSL. The commercial organisations that measured the impact that Heartbleed remediation had on their business said, there's got to be a better way. right? If we've got a couple of people who are working on it part-time and not able to concentrate, and we've got our multi-billion-dollar business riding on top of it, maybe we need to fix that underlying problem. So the Linux Foundation formed the Core Infrastructure Initiative, which is effectively the commercial companies that depend on OpenSSL saying, hey, we're going to contribute to helping solve the problem. And if you're not familiar with CII, I suggest you go to the website and have a look. It is not entirely focused on OpenSSL. It's there to fund any critical infrastructure project. Certainly, Heartbleed was the impetus for kicking it off, but the focus is much broader. So, this is the OpenSSL development team. Notice that it's very geographically spread. And what I've got up there is the country of residence of each of the developers, not the citizenship. If we put up citizenship, we'd have a very different picture. But from that perspective, you can turn around and see it's a fairly European-centric project. And we can thank US government export law as to why OpenSSL has been traditionally European-centric. And in fact, the original export law infrastructure, and Bill will be talking about this in the next presentation, encouraged companies to set up their crypto expertise in more friendly locations, like in Europe and in Australia. So from that perspective, you can turn around and see there's 15 people up there. A range of ages, a range of backgrounds, a range of interests. And what we managed to do after Heartbleed is we got together. So we managed to get 11 of the 15 team members in the one place at the one time. Now, prior to this meeting, the vast majority of the team members had never ever met even one other team member. So for the first time, you're putting a face to the interesting email exchanges. You're going out and spending time, we sit down and we basically spend 3 solid days working together, and as the, sessions close around 5, where we normally closed up about 6:30, we go to dinner and then we socialise till about 3 or 4 a.m. And the hotel we're staying at, beautiful place on the Rhine in Dusseldorf, the staff just left it open as long as there were people there willing to drink, there were staff there willing to serve. So we really, as a project team, managed to get to know each other a lot better. And during the day, we sat down and figured out this concept of not being able to know what's coming is just not acceptable. So we developed the formal policies for how do we go about releasing. We developed an end-of-life strategy. We decided when things were going to get terminated. It's like you can't sit down and keep a code base alive that you've been working on for the last 10 years. You haven't really done anything other than try and keep it alive because people are using it. You have to encourage people to move forward. So a whole pile of releases were announced. You've got a year and then this release is gone. And in essence, that made the amount of effort required for any incoming patch, if somebody gives you a patch and you only have to backfit it to 2 places instead of 7, it makes a big difference to the amount of effort used. And while we were busy in Dusseldorf, Poodle broke. Now, we knew what Poodle was quite a bit sooner. And Poodle was due for release about 2 weeks after our face-to-face, but it leaked. So we as a project team got to do an emergency security release face-to-face in the one room at the one time, after which we changed our release procedures. So in essence, pre-Heartbleed, so pre-April 2014, as I said, only a couple of folks really working on it. Post-Heartbleed, we've got a renewed focus, a renewed team, much broader team, much bigger mix of interests and experiences as well, and certainly an awful lot more focused and enthusiastic. And it's made a phenomenal difference to what's been happening. So if we turn around and have a look at here on the left, that's the GitHub graph picture of everything that's going on. Pre-Heartbleed for 2 years, and I updated the graph today, post-Heartbleed, from Heartbleed onwards to now, and you can turn around and have a look at the difference. In essence, a couple of developers doing everything to, we're looking there, it's 6 developers doing a whole pile of stuff. And in essence, it's much healthier. There's a bigger mix of people. And you turn around and have a look, that there's newer names up in the area. So we've got a lot more code going in by a lot more people across a lot more areas in OpenSSL. And that's a sign of, more people should lead to a much better result. We're certainly seeing a lot more progress, a lot more feedback. Everything's out there on GitHub. The policies are visible to everybody. And in fact, we get people commenting on our policies. It's like, well, why can't you have a policy that says, if a company donates more than $10,000, you'll keep a release open? We go, thank you very much for your suggestion. Next. Certainly the level of traffic and feedback that's been coming from the user base has been much greater post-Heartbleed because everybody's interested. It's like, I might do something that's good for me. I might get some publicity around exactly what's going on. I might be able to see more things that are happening. So a lot of stuff's going on. If you turn around and have a look at how we're going about fixing defects. So CERT has a please turn around and deal with your CVE within 45 days if you can target. Project Zero, it's 90 days. And from a project team perspective, we're trying to hit the 45-day mark. We don't always get there, but that's the objective in terms of we know about an issue, the remediation's available within that time period. And a lot of the time period in dealing with a CVE request, it's not technical, it's organisational. It's dealing with the people who've reported it, it's dealing with the downstream vendors who are impacted, it's dealing with people who are the security researchers who've got their own PR schedule that you need to fit in with, and you've got to recognise that. Somebody did the hard work to find a defect, it's got to have value to their business, so you have to coordinate that. And often we end up with conflicting embargoes and we have to deal with that between the organisations involved. So there's a lot of work that goes in it. The technical work in dealing with an exploit is rather trivial. It's the organisational communication that takes the overheads. Bugs. So in the blue line there is the defects closed. The red line is the defects not closed. So the red line going up is a very, very bad sign. You can see a little point of inflection there. That's kind of about when the project team changed and we turned around and had a much greater number of people working on it. And we, in essence, with resources able to work on it, we're able to go back and turn around and look at a whole pile of defects and deal with them and close them. In fact, there's a whole pile of defects that were sitting in there that were more than 5 years old that had been fixed more than 4.5 years ago, but the defects simply hadn't been closed. But nobody had had the time to sit back and go and have a look at it. So these are the sorts of things that we ended up having to do. Go and have a look at the defects. Now, the target, of course, is to get the defect list down so low that everybody's happy with what's going on. And we're focusing at each release, we actually have a target of no more than this number of defects open that are older than this date. And we're, in essence, we're tracking to being able to hit that target for the 1.1 release. So from our perspective, we see this as a pretty good sign that we're turning around and dealing with the issues. And you can see that it's not just the number closed going up as we close the number left open going down. We're actually dealing with a greater influx of defect reports as well. Thanks. And one of the things you might find interesting is to go and sit on GitHub and click the forks. How many forks have you got? Well, GitHub says there's too many. Now, too many means more than 1,100 forks. So once you break the 1,100, GitHub stops graphing. So forking is a good thing. It means people are using the code base. If you turn around and have a look at the people who are tracking it, the stargazers, more than a couple of thousand people monitoring everything that's going on in OpenSSL. And this is just one of the examples of something that, pre-Heartbleed, this would never have happened. Somebody report an issue and it's remediated in 15 minutes. Post-Heartbleed, this is considered, hey, we should be doing more of these. So we've been focusing in on exactly what should happen in terms of everything that's going on. Now, there is a phenomenally larger community of security researchers focusing in on every aspect of OpenSSL. There's been a formal audit, there's been static code analysis tools updated. The amount of attention that's being applied to the code base is orders of magnitude higher than it was pre-Heartbleed. And that is a good thing for the industry, it's a good thing for the project. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride with an increased volume of information coming in. But the more people who have a look at it, the more research that's going on, the better the code base will come. issues that come in are absolutely addressed much faster than they used to be. And probably one of the single biggest changes in the project is nothing goes into the code base without a second reviewer. So pre-Heartbleed, anybody who happened to have access to the repository, if they felt they wanted to put some code in it went. Post-Heartbleed, basically you've got to get somebody else on the team that agrees with what's going on. If there's a disagreement between the developers, it goes for a full formal vote inside the project team. So that decision making, some folks were worrying, it's going to turn around and mean we move slower. It's actually meaning we move faster. There's more reviewing, more diverse views, less churn in the code base because you actually get the review comments. And a whole pile of that reviewing is actually going on out on GitHub. There's also a private internal review system for things like security bugs. There's a roadmap up, and we report our progress against the roadmap. We don't always get it right. We're not always hitting the commitments that we've put into the roadmap. And when we don't hit them, up it goes, nice and public. We missed this one. Because there's no point trying to hide it. As an open source project, people can figure out exactly what's going on. So we save people the time at figuring out how good we are at keeping our commitments by simply reporting against them. We've basically got to turn around and accept the fact that we're not just a TLS stack. A whole pile of people use OpenSSL for core cryptographic functionality. So we can't just turn around and say, hey, let's ditch those 20 platforms that we don't particularly like to maintain. We have to keep those less common platforms in the code base because, in essence, we have users who are depending on it. We've turned around and, as I said, terminated a pile of releases. Well, in essence, what we're trying to do is have the major stable release and the pending development release. We're trying to sit at a two-release issue in terms of what we've got to deal with. And from that perspective, we realised we had to offer a fairly lengthy end of support date. So for those of you who are still sitting on 101, at the end of the year, there will be no further releases. And at the moment, it only gets critical security updates. And that's simply what has to be done to be able to keep the workload at a reasonable level. What are we doing in 1.1? Well, what have we done in 1.1 in the last little while? We've turned around and, in essence, hit a whole pile of things. The single largest piece of work that's developer impactful is taking all of the internal data structures and making them opaque. And this is a preemptive move to allow restructuring going forward that won't impact users, but it's a one-time hit. And in essence, a lot of the interesting APIs in OpenSSL, interesting means, crappy, are there because you couldn't change anything. You had developers diving into the internal infrastructure, the internal structures looking at fields because there was no other way to do it. So 1.1 is focused on making things opaque for a forward-looking reason. There's an asynchronous API for dealing with the TLS protocol, which happens to couple really nicely with some Intel hardware features. That's something that you'll see a whole pile more information about. IPv6, Dane support's gone into the base code base, a whole pile of things along the lines that are turning around and making life a little interesting. And some of this stuff has been planned for a long time and has finally seen the light of day. And the 1.1 release will be out relatively soon. All the details are sitting up on the website itself. So I'm going to take a very brief side journey on FIPS because, of course, for 5 years, the work on FIPS is what kept the project alive. Without the revenue coming in from FIPS, there would have been no OpenSSL releases in a 5-year time period pre-Heartbleed. And FIPS is, in essence, anybody who wants to do business with US government and sell into US government needs to have some form of FIPS 140-2 validation for their product. So a lot of focus pre-Heartbleed was on this work, which was important to commercial vendors, but not important to all vendors because a number of companies managed to find that they can sell products to somebody other than US government. And a validation process in itself is quite time-consuming. So the first validation for OpenSSL, and I've got to put my hand up, at the point in time this validation was going on, I wasn't part of the OpenSSL team. I worked for what would be considered a competitor. And it was a long journey for the OpenSSL project to get that first validation. It was the first validation that, in essence, was an open source project doing a source build validated process. And it's something that broke major ground in terms of the FIPS process. And if you turn around and have a look at the OpenSSL FIPS certificates, the one highlighted in red down there, that's the only one that's really useful at the moment. The other ones you can't really use. And where all the effort and focus went for, in essence, the last 5 years, pre-Heartbleed, was around 1747. And if you're familiar with FIPS, a lot of vendors do a FIPS validation and then never touch it. Not so for OpenSSL. There's about 50 different updates to that one module. And that's when you're adding tests, adding platforms, adjusting things, dealing with change requirements. So it's a fairly active environment in which you have to work with to move things along. And if you're using OpenSSL for FIPS, you're using the FIPS 2.0 module, which works with OpenSSL 1.0. Does not work with 1.1. Does not work with 0.98. So in essence, you're kind of boxed at the moment to sitting on 101 or 102. To do the next FIPS release, a FIPS 140-2 compatible release for 1.1, is a major effort, and as yet, there's no committed funding for that. Last week, we actually had a vendor stand up and say, hey, I'll fund it, and if that does work out, that will be great, and there'll be a whole pile of work done, and the 1.1 making everything opaque is work that will enable the FIPS module to be less invasive and less irritating to use for end users. And if you're OpenSSL and you have to go around to get multiple vendors to agree to turn around and say, hey, I'd like this platform, you end up collecting a whole pile of platforms. And it's a really interesting mix. This is, at the moment, quite a large list. I think there's been a total of 177 platforms. And there's actually been a total of 244 public OpenSSL-based modules validated, and at least 50 that aren't public that use OpenSSL. So in terms of the amount of FIPS validation requirements being met by OpenSSL, it surpasses every other vendor by a long shot. So what can we do in future? Well, the most important thing from a project team perspective is don't forget the lessons of the past. Because if you are aware of them and you keep an eye on them, hopefully we're less likely to repeat those problems. So we're turning around and basically saying, it's a team. You can't rely on a single individual to basically make no mistakes. Because it really doesn't matter who that individual is, everybody makes mistakes, yours truly included. Don't like to admit them, but everybody does make mistakes. You can't assume people are looking at code just because you make it available. You actually have to sit down and review it. And that's why having something like a review bar prior to anything going into the source tree ensures there's been at least one reviewer. And what we're finding is as we're getting more experience in the team in reviewing code, we'll end up with what looked like something trivial going in, ending up with 12 reviewers sitting down offering alternate viewpoints, and then we go, hey, we need to redesign this piece of code because it's not fitting right and we've all got different viewpoints on it. And you can't rely on automated tools. You absolutely should be using them, but you can't rely on automated analysis tools to replace a human looking through a code base reviewing it. And we'd like more contributions in terms of people looking at the code base and saying, hey, this is an area that interests me. I think these things should change. I'd like to add this. I'd like to remove this. The contributions coming into the code base is what keep the project alive. So the more interactions that we can get with the people who are using the code base, the healthier the project will be, the longer term it will last. And we're particularly interested in a better relationship with people who are using OpenSSL for things that aren't just TLS. We've got a really good understanding of people who are using TLS in OpenSSL, but if you're using it for not the TLS capability, you're an interesting user, would like to have more awareness of what's important to you. And if you have a look at the community page on the redesigned OpenSSL website, you'll see there's a whole pile of other ideas there in terms of things that you could contribute to.
Okay, we have got 3 questions here so far, so let me just pop the first one on the screen. Did anyone inform of misuse of this bug before April 2014?
No, but a number of vendors actually sat down and went back to determine whether or not their existing tools would have generated any log entries if this bug was being exploited. And I'm not aware at this stage of any tool that was out deployed prior to Heartbleed that would have even noticed Heartbleed. So nobody's reported misuse, but I don't think anybody would have been able to notice it.
Does CII funding allow contributors to allay pressure on open source projects to make the software work favourably with their respective operating systems or preferred standards?
That's a big, long question. The actual answer in terms of the commitment that the OpenSSL project had to give the CII to receive the funding for the 2 full-time members was to accept the funding. There are no conditions attached, no requirements to do any particular piece of work, no requirements to work on any features, no requirements to align with the objectives of the CII or even the objectives of any of the CII members. So it was funding intended to help the project with no strings attached. And that's one of the things that actually made it a very generous offer on the part of the organisations that formed the CII.
Any cooperation with the GNU TLS authors?
GNU TLS, from the perspective in terms of sharing defects that are at the protocol level, we have a pretty good relationship with GNU TLS. Defect information that remains confidential in terms of protocol impacts flows in both directions. They're actually quite a nice project team to work with. And in fact, for most of the projects that are either open source or within a vendor that are working on a TLS toolkit, there is a level of cooperation between the developers working on those code bases. The relationships aren't always harmonious, but the information does flow in both directions.
Well, on that note, that was the last of the questions. If everyone can give Tim a round of applause. Thank you. And don't forget to vote or leave your feedback using the app, guys.